morning. We are back with what will be a new season of Cleveland Indians baseball. Here to give a short preview for the 1972 baseball season. The biggest story over the during the off season was probably the move of the Washington Senators to Dallas Fort Worth, where they will be playing in Arlington, Texas, and they have renamed themselves the Texas Rangers. Being in Texas, they've been moved to the AL West from the AL East. And while the Chicago White Sox had displayed interest in moving to the AL East, the league has moved the Milwaukee Brewers to the AL East. I'm not sure what the reasoning behind that was. I'm thinking that it was possibly because they didn't want them to compete with the Chicago Cubs, who were in the National League East. And it may have complicated scheduling matters. There are three new managers starting this season in the American League. The beleaguered manager of the California Angels was not re-signed. That was Lefty Phillips. And taking his place as the Angels manager will be Del Rice. Angels have been in the league since 1961, and Del Rice is only the third manager in the history of the team. Bill Rigney was their manager from 1961 until the end of the 1968 season, and then Lefty Phillips replaced him for 3 years. In the National League, after winning the World Series last year, manager Danny Murtaugh has retired for health reasons. This is actually the second time that Murtaugh has retired as the Pirates manager. He had left the team after the 1964 season. He had managed them from 1957 to 1964. Then he was enticed to come back in 1967 after Harry Walker was removed as manager. I believe that Murtaugh took over for Walker at the end of the 66 season. Then Larry Shepard took over as the manager in 1968. Then Murtaugh came back in 1970 and managed the team for 2 years. And his top coach, Bill Verdon, will be taking his spot as the Pirates manager. And in Cleveland, interim manager Johnny LaPon was not retained as the Indians manager, and he's being replaced by Ken Aspermani, who had managed the Indians' top farm club, the Wichita Arrows, for the last 2 seasons. Another big off-season story or stories, if you will, is the amount of big trades involving big names that started during the LCS last year when yeah, let me find it here. I'm sorry. When California traded their problematic outfielder Alex Johnson. Johnson had been suspended for indifferent play, and then oh, thank you. He the players union on his behalf sued major leagues, saying that Johnson was suffering from an emotional difficulty and should have been on the disabled list instead of suspended. And the arbitrator agreed with them. So the Angels had to pay Johnson for the time he missed, although they did not make Johnson repay money that he had paid in fines. But as soon as the season ended, the Angels traded Alex Johnson and Jerry Moses to the Indians for Frank Baker, Alan Foster, and Vada Pinson. Vada Pinson had had 2 good years with the Indians, but he hated being in Cleveland. And he was almost right from the start of his time with the team in 1970. He was saying he wanted to be traded to a West Coast team, and they were able to accommodate him after the season ended. Then, less than a week later, another clubhouse that had a lot of internal strife, the Boston Red Sox, traded Ken Brett, Billy Canigliaro, Joe LaHood, Jim Lonborg, Don Pavlich, and George Scott to the Brewers for minor leaguer Pat Scrabble, and then Tommy Harper, Lou Krause, and Marty Patton. The What was going on in the Angels clubhouse reached out to Boston because Tony Canigliaro had been traded to the Angels, and he abruptly retired in the middle of the season. And in Boston, his brother Billy Canigliaro was complaining about it, and that he got chased out of that Tony got chased out of Boston because he wasn't part of the Carl Yastrzemski clique. There were like there was a Yastrzemski clique and a Canigliaro clique, and this led to problems in the Red Sox clubhouse, along with players who were criticizing manager Eddie Casco. That was George Scott, Jim Lonborg, and possibly Ken Brett were among that clique. Surprisingly, Joel Hood went in the trade because he was part of the Yastrzemski group, not Canigliaro, and he reportedly hates Billy Canigliaro. I remember reading a book about the Red Sox, and he called Billy Canigliaro a non-human. I read about the Canigliaro brothers, Tony and Billy, and they were both before my time, pretty much. But they each sound like they were a bit of a pain in the ass. So it was probably good riddance to get Billy C out of Boston. As a kid, I remember Jim Lonborg as a member of the Brewers and the Phillies. I don't remember him as a member of the Red Sox. And I generally associate George Scott with the Brewers rather than the Red Sox. And let's see some other of the big deals. Two big ones at the end of November, or actually three big ones at the end of November. It looks like Thanksgiving weekend. Three big deals on November 29th, 1971. Chicago Cubs traded Ken Holtzman to Oakland for Rick Monday. Leo Durocher, manager of the Cubs, was constantly criticizing Holtzman and saying he had no guts. And Holtzman just spent all that time ignoring Durocher. So he'll be going to Oakland. And Rick Monday, who was the first pick ever in the first Major League draft, goes to Chicago. This should help solidify Chicago's outfield. Then the Indians traded disgruntled pitcher Sam McDowell to the San Francisco Giants for Frank Duffy and Gaylord Perry. That's going to be a good trade for the Indians. And then what might be the biggest offseason deal between 71 and 72 is the Cincinnati Reds trading Tommy Helms, Lee May, and Jimmy Stewart to the Astros for Ed Armbruster, Jack Billingham, Cesar Cedeno, Dennis Menke, and Joe Morgan. Might be hard to believe now, but during that offseason, after this deal was made, it was unpopular in Cincinnati because Lee May and especially Tommy Helms were very popular players with the Reds. And but I mean, you could see what the Reds are doing here. They pick up a good pitcher, good outfielder. They got Dennis Menke coming over. He could play third. So they'll be able to move Tony Perez back to first. And they have Joe Morgan coming in to replace Tommy Helms. On December 1st, the Cubs released Ernie Banks. Banks turned out to be kind of a sad story in my APC universe. He went into 1971 with 496 career home runs. And in real life in 1971, he had 4 home runs. He started out the season on the disabled list. And he spent most of the season as a pinch hitter, just like he did in real life. And he got two quick home runs, got himself up to 499, and then it took him 2 months, or he was at 498. It took him 2 months to get to 499, and he never reached 500 home runs. He retired in my APC universe with 499 home runs. He came to spring training in 71 as a part-time coach and possibly an invitee, maybe do a little pinch hitting. But I think they've already decided that he would be a coach and he would no longer play. And then on December 2nd, another big trade. Chicago White Sox trade Steve Huntz and Tommy John to the Dodgers for Richie, now Dick Allen. Allen had spent 1970 with St. Louis, had a good year with them. Spent 1971 with the Dodgers, had a great year with them. Was popular in the clubhouse, popular with fans. But the Dodgers, who reached, in my APC universe, reached the NLCS last year, but lost to Pittsburgh, are beefing up their pitching staff. On the same day, the Dodgers also made a trade to the Baltimore Orioles. They traded four essentially rookies: Doyle Alexander, Bob O'Brien, Sergio Robles, and Royal Stillman, to the Orioles for Pete Rickard and Frank Robinson. Frank Robinson seemed like his career in the first about 2 months of the season last year might be over. He was slumping really bad. I saw some writers reporting, I had never heard this before, but they were reporting that there were rumors out that Alvin Dark was manager of the Indians at the time still, and he was really on the hot seat. The Indians had a terrible year last year. And apparently there were rumors that the Indians were trying to acquire Frank Robinson to replace Alvin Dark as their manager. And I had never heard this before, even like when Robinson ultimately becomes the Indians manager in 1975. So I don't know if those reports were out of Baltimore and not out of Cleveland. Pete Rickard comes back to the Dodgers. He had been with the Dodgers early in their tenure in Los Angeles. So he will be helping, I guess, shore up the Dodgers bullpen, while Frank Robinson will probably take over the veteran role that Dick Allen had performed in 1971. And then that same day, the Chicago White Sox, who made it to the LCS last season but ended up losing to Baltimore, trade Rich McKinney to the Yankees for former Rookie of the Year Stan Bonson. So I guess the trade for Bonson made it a little bit easier for them to send Tommy John to Los Angeles. So they're essentially replacing an older pitcher, Tommy John, with the somewhat younger Stan Bonson. December 3rd, a couple of smaller deals, but probably notable, though. The Reds trade Wayne Granger to the Twins for Tom Hall. Tom Hall, who in 1969 and 1970 was one of the hardest throwing pitchers in my APC universe, but he ended up hurting his arm. And the same day, the Astros trade Bill Greif, Mark Schaffner, and Darryl Thomas to the Padres for Dave Roberts. Dave Roberts, who with the San Diego Padres last year was a 22-game winner. And he finished, I think, number 7th in the Cy Young Award voting. On December 10th, the Angels trade Jim Fregosi to the Mets. Frank Estrada, Don Rose, Nolan Ryan, and Leroy Stanton. That's a deal a lot of Mets fans criticize with hindsight, giving up Ryan, but Ryan was a pitcher at this point in New York who was kind of backsliding, really. He had a manager, Gil Hodges, who had no real faith in him, and a manager and coaching said didn't know what to do with him. They knew he could throw hard, but he, wasn't winning the way they thought he should be. And Ryan and his wife, both from Texas, both hated being in New York. So they bring in Jim Fregosi to play third base, who I was reading some accounts from the 72 preseason that Fregosi's going to be like about the 40th third baseman for the Mets. Mets played 10 seasons now. And last year, during all the controversy with Lefty Phillips, there was a lot of talk about naming Jim Fregosi player manager. Fregosi that was the last of the original Angels. He was the only member of the team that was playing with them in 1971 who had been with the Angels when they started up in 1961. All right, let's see what's next. The Reds were a little surprised. Woody Woodward, the infielder, abruptly retired. I believe Woodward was like 29 years old. But he just called it quits. In fact, Dick Green had called it quits as well with Oakland. Went back to his hometown, I believe in South Dakota, to help run his family's moving business. And Dick Williams wanted him back, the manager of the A's, and they were able to entice Green to come back to play with Oakland this year. January 20th, the Cubs trade John Callison to the Yankees for a player to be named later. So that's another decent outfielder picked up by the Yankees. That was probably in response to the trade earlier for Rick Monday. January 28th, the Expos release Claude Raymond. Raymond will go on to be a longtime broadcaster in Montreal. He was a French Canadian who pitched for the Braves and then went to the Expos. In fact, he basically demanded a trade to the Expos from the Braves, and they were able to accommodate him. February 25th, another major deal. The Phillies trade Rick Wise to the Cardinals for Steve Carlton. It's two disgruntled pitchers with contract troubles being swapped. And then on March 4th, the Oakland A's traded Jim Panther and Don Stanhouse to Texas for Denny McLain. Remember, I hated seeing Don Stanhouse come out and pitch because he took forever on the mound, he seemed like he always had bad control. He walked a bunch of guys. Hated watching him pitch. And let's see. March 22nd, the Red Sox trade Sparky Lyle to the Yankees for Danny Cater, and a player to be named later. In my APC universe, Danny Cater was a pretty good player for the Yankees. Now, let me find it. I think I missed the trade I was looking for involving the Cubs. Sorry, every time I sit down to do one of these, I get a bit of stage fright, and I kind of everything I had planned to say just kind of goes out the window. Yeah, the Cubs traded for Jose Cardinal. The reason I mention that is because 1972 was the first year I collected baseball cards. And I remember the kid across the street and me collecting cards. And one day he called me over to show me this card that he got that looked like nothing we had seen in that set before that. This was probably in September because it was in the last series of the 72 top set. And it was a card of Jose Cardinal. Team wasn't listed, but there was like a big stamp on it that said traded. I wasn't very sophisticated as a card collector at that point. And, we were finding the traded cards as time went on. It turned out there were 7 of them. And Cardinal was one. Jim Fregosi going to the Mets was one. Denny McLain going to Oakland was one. Let's see, that would be 3. Frank Robinson going to the Dodgers was one. Joe Morgan going to the Reds was one. And then Wise going to the Cardinals and Carlton going to the Phillies. So I wanted to make sure I had each of their deals. And let me see what. I'll have to look this up specifically. I probably should have wrote this stuff down. My internet's running kind of slow. Yeah, that was December 3rd. Brewers traded Jim Colburn, Brock Davis, and Earl Stevenson to the Cubs for Jose Cardinal. And Cardinal, I guess, had a reputation as being kind of a lackadaisical player sometimes, but I don't know. what I seen him just in my game, seems like he's a decent, decent enough player. So the season's set to start on April 5th, a Wednesday, with the Houston Astros going to Cincinnati for a quick one-day opener. During the spring training, Players Association's been negotiating with the owners about the player pension fund. The deal that they had signed back in 1969 is expiring, and the Players Association wants the owners to contribute more money into the pension fund to help cover the cost of living adjustment. I just read that at at the end of March in 1972, the cost of living had increased 13% over the last year. So the players want the owners kick in more money to it. Owners don't want to. And then suddenly on Saturday, April 1st, the owner or the newspaper reporters love this because it's April Fool's Day. Players announce they're going on strike. Spring training grinds to a halt, and the players walk. So they're negotiating right now, and there's no telling if the season's going to be able to start on time. As a kid, I remember, like, this is the first year that I was really following sports. I couldn't wait for the Indian season to start. I've been following him in the paper. The Indians ownership group at the time, Vernon Stouffer's group, they were so cash poor. They didn't even like broadcast spring training games on the radio this year. They got another group led by Nick Moletti of Cleveland, the owner of the Cavs, who's trying to buy the Indians. And he's got kind of a handshake deal with the American League owners that the sale will be approved, but they think he's like undercapitalized, so he's like he's bringing in more investors. It seems like shortly he'll be taking over as the owner of the Indians. So right now we stand at April 1st. That's a Saturday. Opening day is scheduled to be the following Wednesday, April 5th. Cleveland is scheduled to open in Milwaukee on, I believe, April 7th, Friday. And that's where we stand right now. It's not known. I mean, it's known, obviously, what happened, but I'm trying to look at this from an April 1st, 1972 perspective. There's no way in knowing. Like, the media is almost all behind the owners on this. This is the only baseball work stoppage that I don't remember. I mean, I remember it, but I don't remember like any of the circumstances about it. And I remember reading this book. I think John Hadler wrote it. in like the late 90s or early 2000s. And he made a fairly convincing case that if the owners had settled this one right away, said, yeah, it's the pension fund, yeah, we'll increase it. This may has like stopped like the further union involvement going forward with like the McNally and Messerschmitt decisions and maybe even the strike of 81. But who's said I have to reread the book though. I'm trying to remember the title of it. I might let's say the Lords maybe, but I might want to reread that. But that's where we stand right now. It's April 1st, 1972, Saturday. The season's supposed to start on Wednesday, but the players that walked, they are on strike. So I will be back soon with a further update. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening.